Hello everyone and welcome back again to my channel. Today's topic, the Kurds in the 8th century. Same criteria as previously, I will only, barring a few notable exceptions, discuss events in which the Kurds are explicitly mentioned. And I will skip the accounts of Kurds in today's Luri speaking areas. However, this video will be structured a bit differently from the previous videos due to a paucity of allusions to the Kurds in this century. I will expand a bit more on the legacy and ensuing folklore concerning this era. First up is the Book of Governors by Thomas of Marga, a Syriac author, likely of Iranic descent himself. His work discusses events of the 7th until the early 9th century. He mentions the Kurds as Kartawaye, which, as discussed in my first video, many other Syriac authors did. In the section on John of Dailam, who lived in the late 7th to early 8th century, he states that when John was young he worked in a vineyard in Dure, a village of Nala de Malka, apparently in the region of today's Acre. Through what appears to be divine intervention, he later appeared in this place. Thomas of Marga cites an old man called Elisha, who states that when he was in that vineyard, the Kartawaye came against me to carry away the iron tools and the provisions which were with me, and when I perceived that they were breaking down the hedge and coming into the garden, I cried out to Marjan to come and help me. And I saw an old man of lofty stature, who appeared to me standing at the door of the cave, clothed in glorious and shining apparel. And when I saw him, gladness came over me. And he deceived those thieves with apparitions, and he hid the cave from them, and having sought much for it, and finding it not, they departed and went away. Thomas of Marga also mentions one David, bishop of the Kartawaye, who probably at the end of the 8th century wrote a book called The Little Paradise, apparently for the notables of the village of Shosh, close to today's Accra. The most striking passage in the Book of Governors is that of the Christians of the village of Zarn in Beth Begash in the 8th century. This is most likely the village of Zarneh of the historic Lower Jilu. It deserves to be quoted in full. There was in the country of Beth Begash a famous village called Zarn, the inhabitants of which were warriors, and they were all mighty men of valor. Not only did they pursue thieves and make raids, but they also showed themselves fierce and disobedient to the royal officers who came to them for the imperial taxes, and many of them they fearlessly drove away with blows. From this village then came the blessed man whose noble deeds I am about to relate, and he and his brother whose name was Shalman, and his only sister sprang from a family of believers, and from people who were prosperous as regards the affairs of this world. And the manner of life of each brother was as different as that of the blessed Jacob and of Esau. For Shalman carried a sword and shed the blood, not of the good, but of wicked men. And because the Kartawaye had at that time begun to commit acts of destruction and theft, Shalman armed himself, and having gathered together a body of men, he put an end to many of the Kartawaye by cutting off their heads. The rumor is reported of him that every day in which he did not lie down upon the skull of some malefactor, whom he had slain with his own hands, as upon a pillow, his food was without taste and unpleasant to him. Additionally, it is stated that his sister became the wife of an individual who likely was Kurdish, or at least Indo-Iranian, because his name was Shah Dost, and he was from Dasen. Their son, Naaman, became notable under the authority of one Zuraik, aka Sadaka ibn Aliyah. This was a Mawali, which referred to non-Arabs who were clients of Arab tribes, often former slaves, who could attain positions of power. This Sadaka ibn Aliyah, a freed man, client of the Ast tribe, ruled over the mountainous district between Mosul and Azerbaijan in the late 8th and early 9th century, and even conquered Urmia. Kurdish historians generally consider him to have been Kurdish. Baba Merdouchi Rouhani even says that he was of the Arumi Kurds. Even though this Kurdish ethnicity is likely, I could not find a primary source that confirms this assertion. Thomas of Marga also mentions an ascetic monk called Abba Abdisho of Kartau from the late 8th or early 9th century who had no door to his cell, so that no man could come into his cell and he could go out to no man. Now he was exceedingly poor, and he had no care for his dwelling place. Even so also was the holy man Gabriel, and he was like the ostriches and other birds, remote and in solitude away from disturbing influences, in the voluntary poverty of his mind. And finally, he also discusses another raid of the Kartavaye, which, however, probably happened in the early 9th century. In the work of another Syriac author, that of Michael the Syrian, we find a passage for this century as well. He states that in 1073 of the Syrian era, which is 762 AD, Jabr built a city on the Tigris River above the city of Ctesiphon and named it Baghdad, which translates to middle, since it's midway between the Persians and the Syrians. In this year, a group of Kurds known as Mark arose and captured 50,000 souls from Gozan. This Gozan is today's Tel Halaf, near the town of Sarikaniye, aka Ras al-Ain. For the beginning of the 8th century, Al-Baladhuri relates another troublesome event, stating, "The Kurds were turbulent and troublesome at the time of the rebellion of Abdurrahman ibn Muhammad ibn al-Ashaf, and al-Hajjaj sent Amr ibn Hani al-Abbasi against them with troops from Damascus. He fell upon them and killed some. Then he was ordered to raid ad-Dailam, which he did with 12,000 troops, among whom were 80 of the Banu Ajr, and their freed men from Al-Kufa. Remarkably, for the year 736, it is mentioned that when the commander Asad moved on from Bukhara to Waraksar, which is all the way in Central Asia, he drove along with him many sheep belonging to the Kurds, which he divided among the men. At Waraksar, he blocked a spring which supplied Samarkand with water. This is, as far as I know, the first reference to the Kurds, this far northeast. Attacks on and trouble in other areas of which we already know that they were heavily populated by Kurds are also mentioned, such as in 748 at Hulwan and Sharazor. Remarkably, the last Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, probably born in 692 or perhaps also 695, seemed to have had Kurdish ancestry. His mother was, according to Tabari, named Site Lubabeya Kurdi. She had been taken a slave by Marwan II's father, Muhammad, and by some reports already was pregnant. He had inherited from her his blue eyes and red hair. He was also known as the Donkey, perhaps for his resolve in battle. He was perhaps the first of the commanders to switch from heavily infantry-based armies to using so-called Kurdus formations, smaller groups often made up of cavalry. Early in his career, he had been active in Azerbaijan and Armenia against the Khazars, even becoming the governor of those two regions. During his lifetime, there were many internal struggles in the Umayyad family, which I won't go over here, but he became caliph in 744, though much of his rule was devoted to combating the rivaling Abbasids. This was a struggle he would lose, and he would die in 750, being defeated in the Battle of the Great Sap River, in what is today southern Kurdistan. He fled to Egypt, where he was caught, then beheaded, and his head sent to the Abbasid camp. The Abbasids tried to wipe out his complete family, with some members fleeing to Spain. Of course, concerning the Kurds, there were also multiple tribes and families claiming his descent. Sheikh Adi, the reformer of the Yezidi religion, generally considered to be an Arab from Baalbek, traced his descent to Marwan II. The historian Al-Umari notes that in today's Hakkari, there was a tribe by the name of Julmarki, deriving its name from the place in which they settled. They originally had been members of the Umayyad family and had fled into the impregnable mountains and integrated into Kurdish society. But perhaps most remarkable is the legend of origin of the Suleymani dynasty of Silvan or Mayafarqin. This legend is mentioned by Sharafkhan. To make a long story short, he states that after Marwan II was killed, members of his family went into hiding in Palestine. And after a while, 3 sons of the family, with a great number of people, left that land and went to the region of Qulb, northeast of the city of Amida or Diyarbakir, and settled in the valley of Deray Khokh, in the district of Khazali. Over time, many of the clans and tribes of the region, who were mostly of the Banuki tribe, gathered around him. With this force, they were able to capture the fortresses of Qulb, Jigse, Tash, Hisoli, Mayafarqin, and the villages, hamlets, and lands, until the river of Diyarbakir. Except for these, he also captured Kela Bedian, Karukan, Tilkalukia, Rabat, Charis, Idnik, Selik, Gensh, from the Georgian and the Armenian unbelievers. Following this, those people of the Merwani who had dispersed to Egypt and Sham went to them. In the end, this tribe would have 8 base groups: Banuki, Havedi, Dilkhiran, Bojian, Zilan, Besian, Zixian, and Berazan. Some of these were Shafi Sunnis and some Yezidi. Even though 1 or 2 sources indeed indicate some continued reverence of Marwan II in this area, it isn't found in other sources. As such, though there may be some truth to the story, it may be assumed that some of the details of this legend instead were derived from the history of the Kurdish Marwanids of the 10th and 11th centuries, and that they were mingled with that of the Umayyad Marwanids to give the rulers of this Suleymani dynasty the prestigious Sayyid lineage, or descent of the Prophet, a legitimizing factor for a ruling family in the Islamic world. Finally, still concerning the Umayyad times of the early 8th century, according to medieval Arabic popular literature, the famed Muslim commander Abdallah al-Battal had a friend named Ajay al-Kurdi, who had been a highway robber but thereafter became the fief holder of Arbil. On to the early Abbasid times. In the year 742, Abu Muslim Khorasani, a famed commander, rose to power. This is a figure of utmost importance, leading the Abbasid revolution against the Umayyads of Marwan II. Some even think he was a crypto-Zoroastrian. There are multiple theories of his descendants. A Kurdish origin is among these, as asserted by Al-Qumi and Ibn Khallikan. In the latter's work, this is discussed in the following manner. Different opinions were held respecting Abu Muslim's origin. Some stated that he was of Arabian descent, others of Persian, and others again of Kurdish. It is in allusion to the last opinion that Abu Dulama said, "O Abu Mujrim, God never replaces by afflictions the favors which he grants to his creatures, unless his creatures misapply them. Ah, thou wouldst meditate treason against the empire of Al-Mansur. Is it not true that thy own progenitors, the Kurds, were always a race of traitors? Thou didst menace me with death, Abu Mujrim, but that lion with which thou didst threaten me has turned upon thyself." Some scholars state that this was quite simply a way to slander him. Whether Kurdish, Persian, or Arab, he was extremely popular with the people. As such, the second Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, ordered him to be killed. His death, however, led to a string of risings in the late 8th and 9th centuries. In some of these the Kurds were also prominent, to be discussed in the future. Continuing into the Abbasid times, according to Ibn al-Athir, in 765 Khalid ibn Barmak, himself Iranic as well, was appointed Wali of Mosul to counter the Kurds' plunderings in the area. Also, according to Al-Tabari, in 774 or 5, when Al-Mansur was informed of the rebellion in Mosul and yet again the Kurds spread into the area, Al-Musayyab ibn Zuhair advised him to send Khalid ibn Barmak to crush the revolt. Interestingly, there are also multiple Kurdish tribes and families which claim descent from the Barmakids, such as some Kurdish families in Chermik, the Dunbulî tribe, as well as the Seviran tribe, who ruled the regions of Hançuk and Çapakçul. The latter is discussed in the Sharafnameh, where Sharafkhan said that their Barmakid ancestors were originally fire worshippers from Balkh, and who quite early on entered in the service of the caliphs. Also mentioned is one of the children of the caliph, Al-Mansur, namely Jafar the Younger, also known as Ibn al-Qurdiya. His mother also was a Kurdish slave, whom Al-Mansur had purchased and abused as a concubine. In the History of Kurdish Greats by Baba Merdukh Ruhani, a compilation of Kurdish scholars throughout the centuries, some are mentioned for this century as well, about whom I unfortunately do not have much further information. Some examples are Abu Suleiman Yunus bin Kürt bin Shariari, who in 752 died in Medina. He also mentions one Abul Hasan Elizargi, also known as Abul Ekradi Saik, and one Hafsa Kurdi. Finally, Ibn al-Athir, for 790, reports that Harun al-Rashid, the fifth Abbasid Caliph, went to Judi, Baqarda, and Bazabda and built a palace there. In medieval popular Arabic literature again, more specifically in the Sirat Dat al-Himma, Harun al-Rashid sends 50,000 Kurds to fight al-Qanasa, but this was in Basra and therefore probably more so relevant for the Lurs. Finally, I might add that quite some of the leading families of Kurdish dynasties trace their descent to the Abbasids, though as stated earlier, it's likely that these were quite simply made up to legitimize their rulership, and that instead these families had gotten the recognition for their local rule by the Abbasids. Note that the Abbasids ruled until the 13th century, so this could have happened quite late as well. Abbasid descent is notably claimed by the Shenbo dynasty of the Hakkari region, by the Melkishid dynasty of Chimizgezek, by the Bahadin dynasty of Bahtidan, and by the Ment or Menteshed dynasty of Kilis. On to the conclusion. For the 8th century, we unfortunately still do not find out much about the inner workings of Kurdish society. In fact, the explicit mentions of the Kurds in this century are rather low. However, several of the important figures of this era, as we have seen, bore some connection to the Kurds, and there are many important events which transpired in Kurdish regions, and therefore no doubt saw their involvement in these as well, as evidenced by later tales. We all too often see the Kurds in a doubly role here, whether it's raiding Christians or involved in Christianity itself, whether Umayyads or Abbasids, whether opposing Muslim forces or bringing forth early Kurdish Islamic scholars and later even claiming descent from important Islamic figures. No doubt this was a tumultuous period for the Kurds and other peoples of northern Mesopotamia, however ill-documented the Kurdish side of history in this era still is. The next century, though perhaps just as chaotic, would bring a bit more clarity for the Kurds. Thank you for watching, and please look forward to my next video, the Kurds in the 9th century.